All right, ladies, this is continuing the Lucifer principle. I think this is lesson 9. I'll check that. If not, it'll be in the title. But we're talking about superorganisms and how they organize and how leaders actually organize and bring together people to carry out their objectives. How you organize people. How do you get people to follow you? And the last section we talked about manufacturing enemies. Fidel Castro, Stalin, that kind of stuff. In fact, we're going through something similar with the demonization of black males right now. Within social media, with Damon Young's article and even Veronica Wells' article out of Madame Noir. Some of these same tropes that have been done from time immemorial, going all the way back to ancient Egypt. Same tricks have been pulled. So this is what we're going to talk about right now. This section is called the perpetual trick that manufactures devils. Howard Bloom was a publicist. So in other words, he worked on manufacturing people's images, much like Kevin Samuels, manufacturing an image that people will actually glom onto. So he's very well adept at how the social dynamic works in manufacturing an image. Perception is a highly selective process. We see and vividly remember some things that pass before our eyes. We ignore many others. Shinjin Young said exactly the same thing. Everybody walks around with a filter. And some we work to actively deny. What happens to those realities which consciousness athletically shuns? They become part of the process that makes the notion of an enemy click. We struggle for position on the hierarchical ladder, trying to get as close to the top as we possibly can. Very few of us arrive there. When the wriggling and kicking is over, most of us find ourselves someplace in the middle. We're blocked out of the realm of the beautiful people, barred from the inmost circles of power and prestige, and never quite reached the utopias of love and fame toward which our fantasies beckon us. How do we live with the daily humiliations built into our middling roles? The mind is replete with gentle anesthetics that soothe these pains. The greatest among them is the perceptual process of cosmetic surgery. The mind covers up the harsher facts of our existence, and it focuses our attention on the few things that can give us self-esteem. Check that out. That's very true. They call that rose-colored glasses. We see what we want to see if we want to be happy. Happiness is perception. From 1972 until 1977, the University of Utah psychologist Marigold Linton kept detailed daily records of every aspect of her life. Periodically, she reviewed those records to see what she could remember and what she had forgotten. The review was a painful experience. Linton warmed up for each of these sessions by trying to recall events of the last year without her notes. What came to mind were the high points, the good times with her friends, the research successes, the new things she'd been able to buy. But examining her 3x5 cards, she brought back a welter of details her mind had thoughtfully buried. The helpless feeling when her car had broken down and there had been no one to help. The fight she'd had with her lover. The feeling of dejection when a professional journal had turned down one of her papers. Linton was not alone. The mind rewrites reality. Look at this. The mind rewrites reality for you and me. Remember that. If you don't remember anything else about this particular section, remember that. The mind rewrites reality for you and me. Elizabeth Loftus, the pioneering University of Washington memory researcher and author of the superb book Memory, points out that people remember themselves as much harder workers than office attendance records show they actually have been. They recall past salaries as being much higher than their old paycheck stubs indicate. They recollect buying fewer alcoholic drinks than they actually did, and are certain that they gave much more to charity than they ever have. They remember, in short, the glory and positive accomplishments. What's more, they exaggerate those triumphs, but their minds erase the tiny daily shames, the manifold humiliations of which life below the top of the hierarchical ladder consists. Instead, says Loftus, the mind erects a comfortingly false picture of the self and of the past. Check that out. This is deep. This is deep. He's going deep right here. Where do the ugly events and the aspects of ourselves we need to forget go? We imagine them as part of our enemy. When World War II was at its peak, the American Jewish Committee commissioned a psychological research project to determine the causes of the fascist horrors. Under this program, a team of behavioral scientists at the University of California at Berkeley developed a test to probe for the kind of tendencies that may have helped a Hitler or Mussolini gain power. And that test, called the F for fascism scale, became one of the most widely used research tools of modern psychology. I'm going to have to check that one out. I remember him. It's been so long since I read the book. We didn't have the internet back then. Otherwise, I'd have looked this right up. In fact, I'm going to look this up. I might have to do a separate piece on that, because that's interesting. I'm fascinated by that. Rereading the book brings out a lot of things, doesn't it? Literally, thousands of studies revealed a profile of what the researcher called the authoritarian personality. Generally, or the alpha male. Generally, this was an individual raised in a strict home where the father was the clear holder of power. The parents had shown a stern disapproval of hostile outbursts on the part of the children. They had also rigidly prohibited the acknowledgement of any form of sexuality. That's interesting. But hostility and sexuality are both unavoidable aspects of human life. How had the authoritarian personalities coped with their unwelcome, aggressive sexual impulses? Sounds a lot like modern American white people. Anyway, through a technique that Freudians call projection, like the female researcher who forgot most of the distressing things that happened to her in everyday life, the authoritarian personalities exclude their own aggression and sexuality from their consciousness. Like the people misremembering their own past pay and work habits, the authoritarian types pictured themselves as people in whom sexual aggressive tendencies did not exist. Aggression and sexuality, they are convinced, boiled up only in the minds of some enemy. And here's the trick. The authoritarians thought frequently of that enemy and his loathsome preoccupation with lechery and hate. Does that not sound like what Veronica Wells thought of when she talked about that particular guy that she says harassed her on the street? She imagined how he would look at her ass and how he might fight her or something like that. They could actually feel the smarmy sexual. Look at this. Right out of street harassment. They could actually feel smarmy sexual sensations and livid hostility that coursed through their enemy's veins. Why could they sense this so vividly? Because they had projected their own set of forbidden emotions onto a faceless opponent, like a ventriloquist projecting his voice into the mouth of a dummy. Fascinating. By seeing their unacceptable impulses in some unsuspecting outsider, they managed to dwell on those impulses and deny them at the same time. That is true on so many levels. Here's how the principle works in real life. During the early 80s, a group of women in Orange County, California, were convinced that the dark forces of secular humanism were using elementary school textbooks to destroy their children's minds. The women's group was certain that the godless foes of true religion were trying to swamp their youngsters with brain-crippling pornography. To find out if their suspicions were true, the women's group members examined the illustrations in the local school's textbooks through a microscope. Sure enough, they discovered minuscule pictures hidden subliminally on the pages. The microscope images portrayed women with naked, nippled breasts and men with enormous erections. The outraged mothers actually succeeded in getting some of the textbook illustrations changed on the basis of their discovery. Remember the reverse speech where they used to play rock and roll songs and said that there were devil worship or devil sounds in the reverse speech. They actually did that back in the 90s. It was really popular about playing things backwards. But where in reality did the pictures of naked men and women lie? Not in the printed pages, but in the minds of the women peering through microscopes. Like Marigold Linton, the psychologist who forgot the events in her own life that humiliated her. The microscope-wielding religionists threw a mental sheet over their sexual impulses, hiding them from view. Then they conceived an enemy, the secular humanists, roiling with forbidden sexuality and working in devious ways to insert sex into their innocent children's lives. The only way to prevent this intrusion was to be eternally vigilant, perpetually on the lookout for humanist sexual invasion. By searching for the humanist danger, the club women of Orange County managed to keep their thoughts focused on sex. But this sexual obsession, they could now tell themselves, was not their fault. It was the fault of the sex-crazed enemy without whom sexuality would have never crossed their minds. Of such rejected pieces of ourselves are our devils made. The perpetual flim-flam practiced by the Orange County women contributed mightily to a war between two subcultures. The concept of a secular humanist enemy undermining American youth is currently being preached by television and radio evangelists on the National Christian Broadcasting Network. We got to remember, folks, this is back in the 90s. On the nation's 221 fundamentalist TV stations and on 1,370 fundamentalist radio stations. It has been aggressively promoted by figures like Jimmy Swaggart, Pat Robertson, and Reverend Donald Wildman, who between them have an annual access to hundreds of millions of dollars worth of media time. And it is being bolstered by a series of multi-million-dollar mailing campaigns whose sophistication makes the Reader's Digest sweepstakes look amateurish by comparison. Prophets of religious rigidity have made full use of the psychological ploy. Don't we know about a black church, which we project our own worst tendencies onto some distant figure? According to the fundamentalist leaders, the secular humanists are a massive, well-organized religious group. They have taken over our radio stations, our television networks, our newspapers, and our schools. These diabolical subversives have allegedly turned everything from television sitcoms to classroom syllabi into anti-Christian weapons designed to enslave the minds of decent American children to a godless, immoral creed. Yeah, some of it is. It's not all by accident. Like Orville Faubus and Fidel Castro, the fundamentalists have used a spectral enemy to forge a flock that is hungry for power. Can we say Black Lives Matter? Some fundamentalist leaders declare that God has made a covenant with its true followers. According to that covenant, he will deliver the political power of the presidency and the Congress into the hands of the believers. Other fundamentalist power brokers declare that this is a Christian country erected on Christian principles by Christian founding fathers. As such, the government of our Constitution is designed to be placed in Christian control. Non-Christians should be excluded. Some of these leaders say from running for public office. After all, non-Christians, in Pat Robinson's words, are termites undermining the foundations of this country. Who are the non-Christians? Non-fundamentalists, according to Jimmy Swaggart. For example, Catholics and traditional Protestants are not Christians. They are mistaken followers of a monstrous lie. How long have we been hearing that? Going all the way back to when Christianity was founded, even before that. Some fundamentalist leaders are more blunt. Catholics, traditional Protestants, followers of EST, dabblers in Buddhism, New Age fans, and others, they say, are followers of Satan. In the name of God, power must be wrested from the grip of the Satanists and placed into the palms of the godly. A simple perceptual device designed to anesthetize us from the nastier aspects of our inner reality has given the fundamentalist movement much of its power. From sexuality, their followers reject within themselves. The leaders have conjured up the lechery of a satanic enemy. From the hostility, the faithful hide from themselves. The leaders have built a fantasy of adversary obsessed with violence. They have crafted the indispensable tool that pulls together. They have crafted the indispensable tool that pulls together a superorganism. With the illusion of that demon, they have relieved the women of Orange County of their sins and welded them into a political force. That is how it's done. How hatred builds the walls of society's bungalow. Frustration turns into hate. Napoleon Duarte, president of El Salvador. Politics as a practice, whatever its professions, has always been the systemic organization of hatreds. Gotta remember that. The systemic organization of hatreds. One more ingredient is necessary to make the notion of the enemy click. Hatred. Interesting. The persistence with which societies offer permission to hate is astonishing. Marxism gives the hate-nots permission to hate the haves. No, Marxism gives the have-nots permission to hate the haves. Medieval Christianity gave permission to hate heathens. Islam gives permission to hate infidels. Unions give permission to hate bosses. Peace groups give permission to hate militarists. Conservatives give permission to hate liberals. Even Jesus gave permission to frown upon the rich. Each culture chooses an enemy on which to blame a goodly portion of the earth's evil and turns hatred of that group into a virtue. But from what raw stock is this group adhesive distilled? The vast number of studies by clinical psychologists like N.H. Azarin, R.R. Hutchinson, and D.F. Drake show that frustration generates rage. Train a rat to run down a straight tunnel towards a piece of food. When it reaches the tunnel's end, it gets to eat. Then place a plexiglass barrier in the rodent's path. When it reaches the transparent obstacle, the rat can still see its food, but can no longer reach it. This is frustration. How does the animal respond? By going into a fury. If you place a bottle brush next to the plastic barrier, the enraged rat will tear the object to pieces. Give him a smaller cousin, he will beat the heck out of the diminutive beast. From these observations and a host of human studies we'll go into later in this book came one of the behavior science's classic formulations, that frustration and aggression go hand in hand. Interesting. But frustration is an experience we cannot dodge. Fashionable as it is to think that none of us can be happy until we fulfill our potential, fulfilling our potential to its limits is an absolute impossibility. If a bacterium were allowed to fulfill its potential within only 4 days, it could produce more progeny than there are protons in the universe. Fortunately, reality's constraints have kept bacteria from acting out their full reproductive possibilities. Human males, like microbes, have reproductive capacities that could swamp out the solar system. That's true. During his lifetime, each man produces enough sperm to inseminate every woman on the planet many times over. A single ejaculation contains between 100 and 300 million sperm, a supply sufficient to impregnate almost every woman in North America. But the individual's sexual potential is something he can never fulfill. Men everywhere from Sri Lanka to Savannah, Georgia, watch women go by and fantasize. Men everywhere from Sri Lanka to Savannah, Georgia, watch women go by and fantasize possessing them sexually. In his imagination, each male couples with thousands of females by the time he dies. That's true. Yet in real life, the average Joe has only mated with a few. That's also very true. I don't know about today. I don't know about today. I think that's changed in the last 20 years. Even chimpanzees endure this ignominious fate. The dominant chimp in the group hoards all the ladies for himself. Subordinate males are starved for sex. When the head chimp is not looking, the lesser beasts sneak up to friendly-looking females and make supplicating, seductive gestures. If the lady seems willing, the furtive Romeo tries to lead her off to some secluded spot where the couple can catch a moment of forbidden love. But all too frequently, as the pair skulks into the shadows, the lordly top-ranking animal catches a glimpse of their departure and punishes the impertinent commoner brutally for poaching on his harem. Oh, man, that is hilarious. That's human jealousy, folks, on both sides. The result for the humans and chimps alike is frustration. and an inevitable is inescapable frustration. If the psychologists are correct, the upshot should be an ever-growing buildup of aggression. In human groups, how can this hostility be channeled to keep us from blowing society apart? It can be aimed safely away from us and used to blast away at them. That is racism, and that is one of the reasons that racism still exists. To get rid of white frustration, still to this day, that's why cops come in and beat the shit out of black males that they stop. It's called white male frustration. There are innumerable causes for frustrations in human life, but the inability to fulfill one's potential is way up there on the top of the list. And that inability by no means is restricted to sex. An ant is born with all the genetic equipment it needs to take on any role in society. If it is fed one mixture of food by the colony's nurses, it turns into a soldier, a powerful beast far larger than normal size, equipped with savage jaws and designed to defend the colony against attack. If it is fed another mixture, it becomes a worker, a small but nimble creature capable of carrying loads many times the weight of its own body. And if it is fed a rare potion reserved for the select few, it can blossom into a queen, the central creature toward whose preservation all efforts are directed, the only ant who gets the privilege of having children. Though an ant may have been hatched, a lowly worker, the blueprints for a soldier and queen still lay dormant within her. Interesting. In fact, if the colony's ruler is killed by marauders or disease, a worker may suddenly blossom with the reproductive powers fate has denied her all her life. She will begin to lay eggs, leaving her food gathering and house cleaning chores behind. She will exude a substance that instills in passers-by the urge to feed and serve her, for she has ascended to royalty. Humans also on occasion go through transformations that dramatize the possibilities buried deep within them. During 1860, the citizens of Point Pleasant, Ohio were distressed by the daily sight of a slightly run-down looking store clerk in his late 30s. The man had been in the military, resigned under suspicious circumstances, failed at farming, failed at real estate, and ended up working in his father's leather goods store. He was a poor excuse for a salesman, a worse than incompetent bill collector, and didn't even seem to know the establishment stock. What's more, there were rumors that he had a problem with the bottle. Then, in 1861, the Civil War broke out, and the town failure enlisted in a regiment of volunteers. Less than 2 years later, he was promoted to Major General. Eventually, he became president. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. Like ants, each one of us is built with all the equipment necessary to be a master or a slave, a beggar or a king. But most of us will only be one of these. We will dream of higher fortunes that could have befallen us, but for the most part, we will never taste those possibilities in real life. As we grow older, many of us will carry an increasing burden of resentment for fates we have failed to have. In some ways, it is the social organism and its needs that determine the role each of us will play, and the many more roles each of us will never be given the power to act out. How the demands of the larger social beast determine our fate is hinted at by another aspect of the life of ants. Some of these Hymenoptera are lazy and sit around all day doing very little. Others will work their tails off in the interest of the community. But try separating the ne'er-do-wells from the industrious and setting them up as two new colonies, one composed exclusively of layabouts and the other made up of entirely of nose to the grindstone types. A strange thing happens. The community of laggards, a large proportion of the lazy little beasts, suddenly become imbued with a furious sense of industry. They turn into workers. On the other hand, in the community composed completely of workers, a small portion of the formerly zealous toilers seem overcome with boredom and settle down to spend their days doing nothing. They become the new leisure lovers. Each new colony takes on the shape of the old one. An individual ant behaves very much like a cell in a developing embryo. Any embryonic cell could just as easily be part of a liver, an eyeball, or a toe. What determines which of those things the cell turns into? Its position. Now, I've heard this more than a few times. Its position in the rapidly unfolding body. The embryo is striving to develop in a certain form. The individual cells behaves almost like it was looking at a blueprint. In fact, there is an opinion or idea that you have an electronic blueprint. Each person has an electronic blueprint that the embryonic cells follow. Figuring out where it is and determining where it has to be to make the embryo come out according to plan. In a chick, you can take a cell that was about to develop into a wing feather, move it to a location that's destined to be a foot. If you perform the maneuver in time, the former wing feather cell will turn into a perfectly normal piece of cloth. This process is called cellular differentiation. This process is called cellular differentiation. The same thing happens to all the worker and all the drone ants and colonies. They undergo differentiation. There seems to be an implicit sketch for the contours of the community. A lone ant in some peculiar way looks around and sees where it sits in the social matrix, then becomes what it has to be to make the community fit the master plan. 90% of human people do that. Human groups go through a similar process. Researcher Richard Savin Williams spent a season watching summer campers interact. In June, the bunkmates met for the first time. For roughly an hour, the campers felt each other out, probing each other's strengths and weaknesses, deciding who would be friends with whom. Then they quickly sorted themselves out into a superorganism with a head, limbs, and tail. One camper becomes the alpha male. Look at this. One camper becomes the alpha male, the dominant individual, the group leader. That's what an alpha male is, the group leader. Another becomes the bully, a big, strong brute nobody particularly liked. A third becomes the joker, everybody's good-natured sidekick. One became the nerd, the unathletic, overly eager sort that everyone else felt free to kick around. Like the ants and the embryonic cells, each boy had taken his place into a kind of preordained social blueprint. Remember the Lord of the Flies. In other words, human beings form a superorganism, the same way that nature forms a superorganism. It's no different. Size has no difference. Just how preordained that blueprint was and how much of his potential each boy had to sacrifice to assume his role became clear when another researcher tried an experiment. The scientists assembled a cabin composed entirely of leaders, boys who had been dominant alpha males in their old groups. Very quickly, the new cluster sorted itself out according to a familiar pattern. One of the leaders took charge. Another became the bully. A third became the joker, group's joker. And one of the formerly commanding lads became the new group's nerd. When the researchers went through the scientific literature to find out other data related to their work, they discovered that studies of Chicago gangs in the 1920s had shown these long-gone groups arranging themselves according to almost an identical conscious plan. Look at that. The gang members of a bygone era had their leaders, bullies, jokers, and nerds. Each individual took up a position in the superorganism's unfolding structure, and each shaped its personality to fit the spot he landed in. In the ant, the possible roles the insect discards may never come back to haunt her. But in humans, the personalities that could have been are always there, always uncomfortable in their imprisonment. They periodically scream from the dungeons of the mind, demanding their freedom. Hermann Hesse, the novelist, said that we each have 1,000 personalities in a mental closet. The circle of our consciousness centers on one, but the others are always in the darkness waiting to come out. Implicit in each of us is the whole society, the dominant individual, the outcast, and all their variations in between. Novelists, more than the rest of us, realize how many possible people inhabit our minds. When these authors sit down to their typewriters, the whole cast of characters come parading into the light of awareness, each ready to live out a new life. And each of these fictional humans is disgorged by the brain of just one writer, who in real life has settled on a solitary personality and fate he will call his own. Buried in the personalities may be erased from the surface of our consciousness, but they still wriggle toward the light in anger, frustration, and jealousy. Every male is built with the same neuronal networks that compel Genghis Khan to conquer an empire twice the size of Rome's. The same set of circuits which motivated some of Genghis' descendants to accumulate hundreds of wives and even more concubines, the same instincts which impelled Turkish sultans to have attractive women from all over the domains shipped in for a few nights of physical glory. But in most cases, those circuits will never unfurl their ambitions in the real world. We have thousands of mental mechanisms crying out vainly for the moment of triumph, thousands of potential personalities that will never be allowed to live. Frustration, as the researchers have demonstrated, breeds rage. Hatred is a despicable byproduct of the human condition. Nature, however, frequently utilizes such garbage as building material. We will see how she has employed the psychological detritus of hatred in a minute. But first, let us take a close look at another example of how the natural world often turns a poisonous exercise to good use. The instance I have in mind keeps each of us from turning into a oozy blob. Communities of cells living in seas roughly 600 million years ago had a chemical disposal problem. From the surrounding waters, they took large quantities of calcium, a substance that could, in megadoses, poison them. To function effectively, the cells had to constantly filter out the calcium out of the water and deposit it outside the cellular back door, where the mineral wouldn't interfere with the cell's internal functions. Somewhere along the line, a cellular community evolved in a clever way of getting rid of its unwanted calcium contaminants. The collective compacted its discarded calcium sludge into safe cylinders and laid these solid slivers of the deactivated toxic waste along the interior corridors between the huddled cells. The disposal techniques produced a surprising benefit. The discarded calcium rods became structural beams that gave added strength and power to the cellular cooperative. They were bones, devices that made revolutionary forms of movement possible and eventually enabled cellular superorganisms to lift themselves out of the water and onto the land. In human society, another kind of garbage, this one psychological, it is used for similar structural purposes. The waste product in this case is frustration. The frustration from which hatred is distilled. The frustration of humans collects much as calcium accumulated in the space between cells of the early ocean living cellular communities. To avoid damage within the group, much of it is directed somewhere else at outsiders. Envy and fear are turned from a source of disruption to a creator of cohesion. Nature has compacted mankind's frustrations to build the superorganism's bones. The demon one society wants to eradicate is all too frequently the god of some rival group. The devil of the Jews, Baal, was the god of the Canaanites. Russia's longtime gods, Marx and Lenin, are devils, or our devils. Our holy middle class is Russia's hatred bourgeoisie. Social organisms, like clusters of anemones on a rock, face off and fight. From that struggle, they frequently derive their identity. Battle draws a set of straggling individuals together to firmly consolidate social clump. It gives the formerly quarreling separatists a powerful common bond. Leaders like Ovo Fabus and Fidel Castro have skillfully manipulated a few basic rules of human nature. That every tribe regards outsiders as fair game. That every society gives permission to hate. That every culture dresses the demon of its hatred in the garb of righteousness. And that the man who channels this hatred can arouse the superorganism and lead it around by the nose. You can see Donald Trump did that very effectively. He took white frustration, white male frustration, white female frustration. He tapped into that hatred of others, or that internal hatred of themselves, and pushed it outside. Fake news, the current ruling class, liberals, Hispanics, foreigners. And he told them, if you follow me, I'll make America great again. I'll get rid of all your frustrations. It's something that is occurring right now in black social media, where there's hatred being generated. Sometimes on both sides. A lot of times it is by the women, where you call your own male offspring terrorist. And it's something that has to be rectified amongst black people. In other words, black people white supremacy is not the old enemy that it used to be. So where does that hatred go? Something to ponder. But like I said, I'm running out of steam here. Very good section. A lot of things that go on in politics gets played out over and over and over again. You can see how this is played out in politics, in global politics, in business, us against them, in sports. We can show a lot of examples from there, but I'm sure you guys can come up with your own examples. But with that, I'm going to cut out of here. I hope you got something out of this particular segment. He actually builds a very good case. You can actually see it form in front of you. That's why I use the book. But ladies, I'm going to bow out. I'll see you guys on the next one.